Trust, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to the first of our spring lecture series. Those of you who have been attending it used to be known as the winter spring lecture series, but we've obviously moved with the times and decided to be less onerous on you to drag you out in better weather. Those of you who have attended over the last 6 years, I think we've been having these series, will know there's been one common theme or thread, and that has been revolution. So we've looked at the Irish Revolution from an international perspective, from a national perspective, and from a local perspective. We've had views of the roles of government and the roles of our political parties or nascent bodies, and we've looked at, we've had grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the main participants giving their families' view of revolution. And today we're looking at a theme which we've been before, gender, the role of women, but this time rather than the role, it's the way women were treated in that Irish Revolution. And I'm delighted to welcome, it's a privilege to welcome Professor Linda Connolly, who is the head of the Research Institute for Social Sciences in Maynooth, which in our rush for abbreviations and acronyms is known as MUSI, but I think we'll refer to it as the Research Institute. And they concentrate on two main areas. One is people, place, and environment, and the other is in transformations in economic and social events. But those of you who are readers of the Irish Times or cognoscenti of opinion will know that Professor Connolly is well known for expressing her opinions on the role of women in general, and in particular in academic institutions, not just in academia in those institutions, but in the way that they are run. And Professor Connolly has made a contribution, and indeed the violence suffered by women during the Irish Revolution has already sparked some interest and got some very interesting press when it was first launched, particularly as it wasn't just those awful black and tans who did it, you know. And I think that's useful because here in Glasnevin, what we're about is telling the stories of those buried here. Our main role is to bury and cremate the dead with dignity. But as I often say, and I apologize for saying it again, the ultimate dignity is not to be forgotten. And I can assure you that there are many women buried out there who suffered during the Irish Revolution. Maybe we don't know their stories yet, but perhaps in time we will learn more about them. And we think that's important, particularly as we're now entering the second phase of the decade of centenaries, the period where it was the War of Independence and then the Irish Civil War. So if we can start contextualizing without judgment, I think that would be important. And we leave it to people like Professor Connolly to give that judgment on that. But here in Glasnevin, we just want to tell the stories. And if you don't think it's important that we do that, well, it's 100 years since the War of Independence, Civil War. It's 50 years since the Troubles began in the north of Ireland, and today the papers are dominated by two different stories. One is whether John Downey should be extradited, and the other is whether Karen Bradley is off her rocker by saying that all crimes committed by soldiers weren't crimes, all this says. And it's got very, very tense there. So I think we have a role here to be measured in what we're looking back, and to remember that the high moral ground doesn't really apply when you're looking back in history. And there's a great old man who was in Claremont Village here, Sean Brophy, who did a lot of work on what happened. He used to have a carol concert, but he'd tell the story of the year, so 1914 right up to 1918, and Neil Fortius died, but his brother's doing a summary of it. And he used to say, we're looking at history through the human prism. And I can assure you, with over 1 million humans out there, that's what we do best in Glasnevin. Good.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice welcome. Can you hear me? Oops, it's not on. Sorry. Oh yeah. Thank you. So thank you very much for that very kind welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Didn't have time to visit my great-grandfather's grave, William Connolly, who died in Great Charles Street in 1912 from pneumonia. He and his wife hit hard times. They were from County Meath. grazier family, but he had a bit of a downward, shall we say, situation, and he died in actually quite poor circumstances, but I will come back when I have time. I found that it pushed me to find the spot where he's buried, he and his wife, Rose Gernan, and I intend to do that. So it's very nice to be here with that in mind and thinking about my great-grandfather. And I won't say I'm delighted to be talking about this topic because it's a very serious topic, but I am very pleased, I suppose, to be able to discuss this issue tonight. Just to say, I suppose I'm a trained sociologist who works a lot in historical material. So sociologists tend to be, I suppose, primarily concerned with power and how power operates in society, including in times of conflict and revolution. So for me, I suppose, fixing my gaze on how issues of power impacted on women in this period really has opened up a sort of a Pandora's box. I'm also very interested in questions of violence, in particular gender-based violence, from a lot of work I did in the 1970s, which is really when in Ireland we only really first began to recognise issues such as domestic violence as being a crime. These issues used to be something, the confessional advice was, that's a private issue to be dealt with privately within the family, not something that is a kind of a public issue, that is legislation, that has a whole series of provision, etc. And it was the same with rape and Rape Crisis Centre. So all of those stories that we saw coming out of the second wave of feminism really haven't really been, I suppose, inflected back in a way into looking at past evidence of these questions around what we might call gender-based violence, broadly speaking. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, and I am going to try and focus on the stories rather than the concepts, but I do think some of the concepts are very important. And how we, I suppose, define violence is very important, is the first thing I'm going to say. And I suppose really that during whatever kind of armed conflict we're talking about, and there's a lot of discussion about the scale of the Civil War, the scale of the War of Independence, etc. What kind of conflict was it? What kind of revolution was it? What was its scale? But regardless of the right answer to that question, during all armed conflicts, women's bodies become battlefields in a way. And I think what's most interesting about the kinds of stories I'll be focusing on tonight is they almost, as you said quite rightly in the introduction, they transgress both sides of the conflict. They affect all women of all sides. And I suppose the kind of violence women experienced was inflicted by all sides. So it tends to, if you like, transgress the oppositions that exist during phases of conflict. And I suppose I'm interested in why that might be the case. So that's the first thing. What kind of violence are we talking about? And how have we defined violence in Irish revolutionary history is a really important question. And I think we haven't looked at gender enough, but we also haven't looked at the international context around gender, which gives us a lot of clues about what happened in Ireland. So that's the first thing. I suppose the second part of this is what really got me into this as well, I suppose, is I was aware of an early article by Professor Louise Rhine, who's also a sociologist, in 2000, nearly 20 years ago. And she published an article in Feminist Review. Interesting, not in a history journal, or it wasn't a history text as such, a history book. And she was the first, the title of her article was Drunken Tans. And she focused on exactly these same questions. But I suppose the sources we have today, compared to when Louise first wrote that path-breaking book, are much richer and allow us to revisit some of the early themes of Louise's work. And Matthews later also mentioned these questions in her book 10 years later, Renegades. And she described what women experienced as a living nightmare, was the term she used. So there is earlier work, but I suppose in the contemporary context of commemoration and all the new sources we have, we can revisit some of those questions and I suppose build a bigger picture of what happened in that period. So part of my motivation was, as I said, looking at power, questions of power and conflict and gender, looking at, I suppose, what do we mean by violence? When we talk about violence, what are we talking about? And thirdly, I suppose, what I saw as a kind of a position emerging during the decade of commemorations, that Ireland was somehow an exception when it came to violence perpetrated against women. And if you go to Tim Wilson's book, comparing Upper Silesia with Ulster, you see this kind of argument. Sexual violence wasn't a problem. But I suppose my problem with that was that it was based on a very narrow set of sources in one particular part of the country, and wasn't really looking in this kind of holistic way that I had known violence to be studied in other contexts. So again, there's other examples I could give. This idea, I suppose, that this wasn't really a problem in the Irish Revolution. So this kind of spurred me on to really get my teeth into this. And of course, like most researchers, then you literally become addicted. You find more evidence and more information, and we have a lot of evidence. So as my sort of preamble, I suppose, really, I think it's very important that we look at questions of violence in this holistic sense. I suppose just to say as well that again, it's very important to look at, with all the new sources around military archives, etc., to look at the agency of women. Women have made a huge contribution to the revolution, but as you said in your introduction, but what was the impact of the conflict? So I'm looking at the worst end of this, if you like, of that question, and just to say that, and also to say that some of these stories are very harrowing, and just to say, if anybody, it is a kind of a trigger warning, I suppose, really, in a sense, that if anybody's triggered by some of these stories, I would suggest, to contact some of the rape crisis centres, etc. I'd be happy to talk to anyone about that, because we are talking about issues that haven't gone away, and I suppose listening to the family of Clodagh Hall last week and talking about the violence she experienced and so forth, these are very real questions in contemporary societies. So I feel that if we're not able to confront these issues in the past, how can we deal with them adequately in the present is really important. Okay, so I'm just going to skip along. I'm not going to do a literature review. I want to, I'm going to approach this question in terms of two issues. And the first is, it might sound a bit, the title might sound a bit facetious, but I'm just going to talk about hair. And why is hair important, you might think? Well, apart from her image and all the rest, women's hair is actually remarkably significant in understanding how gender and sexuality shaped the Irish Revolution. Forced shearing of women's hair was practiced very widely indeed. Anyone know where this is from? I'm sorry, the image is bad. Anyone guess where that image is from?
Ryan's daughter.
No, that one is from The Wind That Shakes the Barley. And sorry, I took it from a screen, a movie, so it's not a great quality. But you can see he has the shears in his hand, yeah. So he is a black and tan in this case. So the forced shearing of women's hair crops up in numerous, not just archives, but popular sources, such as movies and films as well. I'll just give you... This is Ryan's daughter. And again, I'd forgotten all about that until I rewatched the film, that there is, again, the story, she was having an affair with the soldier. She was married to the local moonshore. And then, in this case, the woman cut her hair from the village. So again, you can see this kind of popular, and again, this is from The Wind That Shakes the Barley. That's Ken Loach's movie. I can't remember the year. It's quite a recent film. So reference to it, as I said, crops up. Conor Heffernan describes a scene from Ken Loach's film. He says, troops storm into the house and forcibly evicting those inside. Screams of terror emanate from the house, growing louder and louder with each moment. Soon the house will be set on fire. In the melee that ensues, troops single out a woman known for collaborating with the enemy. Held down at gunpoint, her head is shaved. In the distance, fighters from the other side look on as she wails. Similarly, as I said, the fictional character of Rose had her hair sheared by a mob for having an extramarital affair with a British officer. Heffernan writes that Loach's depiction touched upon a seldom discussed set of events in the revolution, especially during the years 1919 to 1921, when we're talking about hair cutting in particular. He said atrocities were committed on both sides, and subsequent generations have yet to fully examine them. Intimidation and head shaving are just one example of Ireland's past that historians have yet to discuss adequately. So the social and political meaning of forcibly shearing women's hair, I would argue, lacks a kind of historical analysis or sociological analysis. So I'll give you some examples of it in a minute, but why cut women's hair, and why do this, I suppose, is what we might ask. It also occurred with some regularity later, in fact, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and the term tarring and feathering was used there. There was some tarring in this period as well, but I've only some examples, and I probably need to do a bit more work on that. It's also, again, I haven't worked on this, some of you 19th century people, it also occurred during agrarian conflict in the 19th century as well, so it's nothing new, I suppose. I would argue that coerced, as in forced head shearing, was in fact a kind of a serious assault. And you'll often read in the literature that, oh, well, they just had their hair cut, sure, they were fine. But actually it involved often dragging, pulling, injury, unwanted touching, etc. So it's not simply a kind of a lenient punishment, shall we say, physically or symbolically, because to have your hair cut in this way obviously has huge visibility and a symbolic import. So frequently, as I said, it involved a woman who may be dragged and indeed held down. There's also a tendency to treat this hair cutting, shearing, whatever you want to call it, cropping is another phrase, as kind of separate from other forms of violence. Oh, that wasn't sexual assault, that was just hair cutting. But in fact, what I have seen is an interlocking kind of system of violence where you often have physical punishment with the cutting of hair, your verbal abuse, and women can be blindfolded, dragged away up fields, etc., and sometimes sexually assaulted, or indeed killed. So there's a continuum at work here when we're talking about what we mean by violence and definitions of violence. So Mary, or Molly Alleyne, as she was called, her marital name from Youghal, active in the Youghal branch of Cumann na mBan, described how she was beaten by British troops and had her hair cut off when her house was raided several times in her witness statement. As I said, the public humiliation of having a scalped head within the community followed on. The hair could also be pulled and roughly handled, with other injuries inflicted at the same time, such as cuts from razors or shears, combined, as I said, with physical assault, beatings, shouting, touching, mob behaviour, etc. by the perpetrators. I've looked at the work of an American author, actually a legal scholar called Pergamont, to find out some of the kind of meaning of these practices. And she argues that hair also has important social functions. So it's not just about that kind of infliction of violence as we understand it, as kind of that physical punishment. It also has a lot of social functions. So in all societies over time, hair is an object of intense elaboration and a kind of a preoccupation in all kinds of cultures throughout time. It has played an important role in terms of how we view sexuality in particular. And again, we might take this further and say this is not just a form of violence or assault, but it is perhaps a form of sexual assault. And the reasons for this, I suppose, are that past uses of hair as a means of what was called hair taking by states. And we see this in contemporary conflicts where you literally have places like Sudan, the conflict in Rwanda, etc., where these practices of shaving women's heads still continues. So hair taking in some cultures is, I suppose, a belief that the person gains possession of the person through their hair. Again, in keeping with symbolism, if you look at different practices over time, as well, violation of hair is seen as a violation of a woman's honour. And I suppose this is what we mean by sexuality. It marks her out as a kind of a sexual transgressor, a whore. In the case of Ireland, of course, often a collaborator with men on the other side. When we get to the Second World War, you'll be familiar with the horizontal collaborator term that was used when over 20,000 women in France had their heads publicly shaved in this way for this kind of sexual collaboration with the enemy. So there's lots written, I could go on, there's lots written about not just the kind of punishment, the physical punishment, but the symbolic importance of hair taking as a means of exercising coercion and control over women in a situation of conflict. And particularly in a society with the kind of structure of Ireland in this period, the community structures, the way in which society operated. We've later studies like Arnsberg and Kimball in the 1930s looking at how communities operated, but we're talking about very close-knit communities. These practices were highly visible, to say the least, particularly in the aftermath of the hair cutting. Just a brief word on, so again on how it compared with the practice elsewhere. As I said, I suppose I'll just give you a few images. I mean, just to say we have one piece of film which you can look up afterwards from the Irish Independence Film Collection. And again, you can see at the bottom, this is May Connolly in Limerick. And she had her hair shorn for the crime of speaking to the Black and Tans. And again, it also suggests somewhere else that she was actually beaten. It's not on this website. I can't corroborate that. But again, this was, I said, was used by both sides. That's a little bit of footage. So here, again, one of the, I suppose, how does it compare with the practices elsewhere? We see this again occurring in the Spanish Civil War as well. And you might see variations in the practice. So women who had their heads shaved in Toledo, in this picture here, because they were relatives of Republicans. There's a lot of work written on sexual assault and rape. And also in Spain, there was, again, I have no evidence of this occurring in Ireland, but widespread use of castor oil ingested to these women, forcing them to publicly soil. So again, this is all, you can see what we're talking about here is it's humiliation. It's public, isn't it, humiliation? It's horrible. And it occurred, I suppose, with its own form, content, etc. in the Irish Revolution. This is this I could go on about this all day, but again occurred in many different countries: Belgium, Italy, Norway, the Netherlands, the Greek Civil War. We see this happening as well when we get to the 1940s. Again, different practices, almost a carnival aspect in France, where it was done publicly. The lipstick with the swastika symbols painted onto the women, and a public parade. Whereas in Ireland we see a more, I suppose, private way, often up the fields, away from public view, etc. It didn't have this kind of carnival-esque element. So again, the same kind of thing, les femmes tendues, or the shorn women, according to Duchenne, were paraded through the streets, bald and stripped to their slips, swastikas painted on their chests and foreheads, sometimes with their own lipstick. Thousands of women were reported to have committed collaboration horizontal. And sadly, she writes, what is absent from these reports is whether or not these women consented to their crimes, first of all, and meaning, I suppose, that many women may have been punished and shamed for their own rapes. So there's a lot has been written about this in the European context. Okay. Again, I could talk a lot about Belgium, Spain, etc., but I better move on to more examples from Ireland. So what evidence exists for this in Ireland? Well, quite a lot. I suppose, so one of the, again, I'm going to talk in some of the recent examples. So obviously the newspapers have lots of references to these issues, and but also recently the witness statements and the pension files, etc., have become a kind of a treasure trove. And if there was a suggestion before that this didn't really happen in Ireland, well, I think that's been utterly disproven now with the recent files that have come to bear. So here I just have an example, I suppose, from Leo Buckley, who's from Cork, and he very much intimates here, I've analysed kind of the the language in some of these statements. So he has very much a sexual justification for the bobbing, for women considered fraternising with British soldiers. And I think the term at the bottom there, the appearance of a girl with bobbed hair clearly denoted her way of life. Now I wondered, was that a reference to prostitution or not? It's difficult to say. I haven't been able to find, I've talked to the court historians, whether or not they were just meeting the soldiers or prostitutes is not quite clear, but you can see very quickly, so it was justified through a kind of it was their sexuality, their sexual behaviour, which was the problem here. Again, this is one I often use when I give talks, because I just find it very evocative. And this is another witness statement, and I suppose the whole other area is the punishment of informers. And of course, informer has quite an elastic definition, doesn't it? It could be maybe having a chat, or it could be being an actual, very highly organised informer. Some of the statements from the members of Cumann na MBan show just how sophisticated their military activity was. So this one in particular, again, as we see, it's Michael Higgins in County Galway, and this girl, I'll read out a bit of it. I suppose she had written to an RIC man, giving him information about volunteer activities, and as was very typical, the letter was captured in a raid on the mails. So he said, we brought the letter with us, and Brigadier Fogarty read it out for the girl and her people when we arrived at the house. So again, typically arriving at the house rather than this parading, through the centre of the village that we saw in post-Second World War II France, etc. The girl admitted writing the letter. Brigadier Fogarty gave them a lecture on the gravity of the offence and said she was being treated leniently in having her hair cut off. There was a scene. The girl was crying and her people were sprinkling holy water on her and on us. She was a very beautiful girl before her hair was sheared, and I pitied her, although I knew I should not in the circumstances. So I think that's kind of evocative, the scene of kind of throwing the holy water. Anyway, so the assault in this instance was witnessed by the family rather than the whole community. Haircutting is mentioned in numerous witness statements submitted by men and women in the military archives. In addition, Elizabeth Bloxham, a Cumann na MBan activist, for instance, reported in her statement of 1951 that these were the days when girls were roughly searched and had their hair cut off by British soldiers. I'm not going to talk about what we term today as sexual harassment, but there is quite an interesting, set of evidence around that kind of thing of rough searching, and that kind of, passing through your business on a daily basis. And that's something that's written about in relation to women who cross borders all the time in many contexts. So this kind of daily, bodily searching, bodily contact, sexualisation, again, is very powerful in some of the narratives. Peg Broderick Nicholson from Galway described how she was called out from her bed and had her hair cut to the scalp with very blunt scissors. So for decades, historians of the Irish Revolution either completely omitted discussion of this widely documented practice or considered it lenient punishment worthy of a footnote or passing reference. This is in stark contrast to the obviously much larger wars conducted in other parts of the world, Belgium, France, Germany, etc. But I suppose what's missing here is that there has been analysis of much smaller conflicts, including civil wars elsewhere, where the head shaving of women has in fact sparked immense debate about the sexual, gender and power relations exhibited by this form of punishment. And this didn't happen in Ireland. Louise Rhine's article in 2000, 20 years ago, was met with silence. Nobody picked it up. Nobody discussed it really, as I said, until more recent years. So a body of literature examining this practice internationally exists, but Ireland's contribution to this form of debate internationally has been sparse in contrast, with the received analysis of the revolution, quite rightly we might say, focusing mainly on deaths, disappearances and the fate of male combatants primarily. But of course there is another side to this story, I would also say. Prominent texts on the War of Independence and the Civil War by Bill Cassan, Peter Hart, And David Fitzpatrick, for instance, didn't give any sustained attention to the attacks on women in this period. And I know some of them came across these issues because I asked them. So they weren't included in the narrative, I suppose, or in the overall narrative. Kazan developed comparative theories of civil war and has examined the historical amnesia characteristic of many civil wars, including in Finland. But no detailed analysis of this kind of gender-based violence in the Irish case is provided. And this, I would suggest, is a vast omission when you consider how gendered and familial civil wars are. So it's not just brother against brother, it's brother against sister, I think, which is the bit I want to focus on. Okay, there's a lot more I could say, but I'll move on. So really, I suppose what I'm trying to do here is just get us thinking about the way in which hair operates in terms of the revolution, and why really that hasn't been considered, I suppose, as a serious form or a serious issue in terms of how violence was constructed in this period. Now, just to kind of build the picture a bit more, so I'm going to move on now to perhaps the more difficult aspect. And as I said, I'm lifting out hair, lifting out sexual assault separately, and then I suppose I'll put it all back together when we get to the end of the paper. So if an Irish exceptionalism view existed about hair taking, hair cutting, we could say even more so in relation to the very difficult question, complex issue of sexual assault and rape, and even how we define these issues, and the language of the time presents challenges. This research is always challenging, whether we're talking about the kind of violence that was discussed in the Irish media last week, or the 1970s in relation to rape crisis issues, and even more so perhaps in relation to what occurred 100 years ago in a phase of conflict. But having said that, that's not an excuse not to examine the question and to focus on it in a really serious way. So again, an Irish exceptionalism view apparently exists when it comes to sexual violence in this period. A paucity, I suppose, of statistical evidence, or indeed documentary evidence, has in fact been cited to suggest there was very little rape in the 1919 to 1923 period, especially when we compare to other conflicts, I suppose, where you see that rape is referred to as a weapon of war, or mass weapon of war. And we have many examples of this, don't we, across the world, really awful examples. So again, Ireland, there might have been a few rapes, but really it wasn't used as a weapon of war. It has been the kind of view. But I think the situation in Ireland is much more complex than that. And again, we need to approach sources and analysis in a very cautious way, I would say, without overemphasizing, but at the same time not underemphasizing either sexual crime as it might have occurred and did occur, I would suggest, in this period. So Townsend, you see hints, I suppose. So this is kind of very typical, where historians might say, well, it might have occurred, but we're not really sure. But again, he hints at some evidence here. He said there must also have been sexual violence, though it was much less well attested. There were undoubtedly cases of rape, probably more than the few that were formally reported. Well, I'm sure very few were reported, because the culpability to prove rape was on the woman, and that was a very difficult thing to do. Also, huge loss of respectability. The term fallen woman was that the woman was somehow culpable, in her situation that she found herself in. Okay, so he says, which may indeed be surprisingly few, certainly by the depressing standards of the contemporary world. The truth remains obscure. As the Cork Gaelic leaguer Caroline Townsend said, it is very difficult to get facts about such cases. This is true. In November 1920, Lady Gregory heard from her doctor in Galway that the family of the girls violated by the Black and Tans wished to be hushed up, and another case of the same sort in Clare was also to be kept quiet. And I find this fascinating, because again and again, people have written to me who are doing research in other contexts, the American Civil War, and they would say they keep coming across this line, hushed up, to be kept quiet. It's absolutely the key terminology in which we are trying to approach and understand sexual violence, and that was the attitude. Okay. So keeping that in mind, I suppose, rape, I would say, has always been underreported or never reported in Irish history, and in fact this remains the case even today, where we have greater knowledge. The numbers reported, certainly the numbers that end up in the courts of prosecution, is minuscule, quite frankly. It is by definition a hidden crime or atrocity to be kept quiet and covered up. Local doctors, interestingly, often quietly dealt with the physical or psychological impact on such attacks on women and girls, which suggests that it's not military history, but the techniques of social history or medical history and women's history must also be used and combined with the received observations from military history to understand sexual violence in Ireland. As I said, the shame of being a fallen woman or a single mother after a rape, or considered a woman of dubious morality by reporting it, would have taken precedence over what we call today justice and accountability. That would not have been a concern. As De Cruz points out, a woman forfeited her respectability merely by the fact of having been raped. The suppression of the Carrigan Committee's findings in 1930 to 1931, which, cutting a long story short, looked at the incidence of sexual abuse in Ireland at the time, in particular of children, rates of incest, etc. Now, I don't know if you know much about the Carrigan report. It was shelved, it was quashed, because it had statistics indicating increased levels of sexual assault, mainly of women and children, but also some men and boys, of course, which is also an extremely important part of the overall history of sexual violence. So it was written, obviously, in the early 1930s. Carrigan was the head of this commission, chair of the commission. As I said, the report was shelved by the Minister for Defence. They didn't like the findings and the terms used, that the children might be imagining it, stuff about the women as well. So there was kind of a suspicion and a concern about perpetrators, which again we see all the time in the sources. And we see this in some of the sources being held back, we might suggest. There's a concern not to name perpetrators. So we'll talk about that in a second. I suppose really this is also of relevance in contextualising the incidence of sexual violence, because when we get to the 1930s, we are again talking about, cover up might be too strong a word, but we are talking about, I suppose, being afraid of the facts, or certainly hiding the facts. This report was shelved, it was quashed, it wasn't liked. A particular version of the Free State was being evolved, obviously, at the time. Okay, again, I'd love to say more about that. But anyway, and again, this idea that the women and children could have provoked the assaults through their behaviour, or as I said, imagined them, is again evident there. Finola Kennedy has written a fabulous article on this, which is really, I think, the best piece on this. So it's apparent as well that some rapes were actually suppressed during the revolutionary period or never reported. Rare investigations uncovered into alleged perpetrators on the British side or the Republican side were typically marked secret and closed with no punishment indicated. Perpetrators who were soldiers were generally not named or documented in records, if sanctioned internally in secret IRA courts. Context and culture is therefore extremely important in arriving at a better understanding of the scale of rape that occurred in Irish society. We have to take into account all these, I suppose, barriers or issues. Joanna Burke, in her majestic book on rape, points out that there is no crime more difficult to prove than rape, and no injured party more distrusted than the rape victim. So any suggestion that there are only a handful of cases in the military archives or other public sources, such as the press, therefore appears premature as a definitive reading of the true scale of sexual violence in Ireland's revolution. Cover-up was the default position, including for the individual woman, calling out a rape within a victim's family, never mind, in public or in a community or among combatants, was clearly an infrequent occurrence. But that cannot be definitively conflated with concluding that rape was completely rare in revolutionary Ireland. So I would say rape was not completely rare, and I would speak back very strongly to that. And we do have some evidence of that. So here again, We have, for example, here I have a return showing the number of serious crimes reported to the Gardaí during the 6 months from July 1923 to December, a short period. And again, I'll let you look at I won't go through all the statistics, so you can see the number reported cases in which members of the National Army were guilty, suspected of being guilty. Sorry, there's something wrong with that table there. And I think this is guilty, and I think this is the number reported, and those were also found guilty. Sorry, a bit wrong in there. So again, anyway. So that's a 6-month period. Okay, that's from the Blythe papers, if anyone wants to follow up. So again, I haven't gone down a bit further to match those stats with something else, but those stats do exist, I suppose, is what I'm saying, in the Blythe papers in UCD. And there are lots of, I suppose, what we might call more qualitative claims. And again, here we have another statement where there were 2 reported in Blackpool in the same locality, and this is the case of the Black and Tans. I suppose claims made by male combatants in witness statements are also very instructive. But they do require, I suppose, further investigation, because things can be said. So I suppose the examples I use, I do try to corroborate them as best I can. There's always been a concern, I suppose, that propaganda, trying to make the other side look bad by saying they were engaged in these kinds of practices, is something we have to be mindful of as well. So James Maloney, again, in another statement from Bruff, County Limerick, for instance, stated that IRA men's sisters and other girls had to go on the run fearing rape. The IRA gritted its teeth and showed little mercy to the Tans after such outrages. The women's movement at the time wasn't silent either. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington issued a statement of atrocities against women, again, which is an interesting source to look at. Brian Hanley, the excellent historian of this period, has remarked, it has generally been believed that instances of sexual violence were rare in this period, but they may in fact have been understated. I know of at least 2 more, one involving the Free State Army in Kerry, which is the Kenmare incident, I'll talk about in a minute, and also the Special Constabulary in Armagh. In June 1922, B Specials raided a pub in South Armagh, seeking its owner, Republican activist James McGuile. During the raid, women were beaten, McGuile's wife raped, and a servant sexually assaulted. Victim narratives in Irish history are also slowly coming to light in unseen sources, if you like, as well. And I've mentioned the records of doctors who treated victims of assault, because remember, often there was physical injury as well as psychological trauma involved in these attacks, and they must be identified. But I just want to mention what I think is an absolutely groundbreaking article by Lindsay Erner Byrne. And Lindsay came across a letter from a woman she calls Mary M, and I'll let you read it yourselves. But she was attacked, as you can see, sexually attacked. She was actually a woman in her 40s looking after elderly aunt and uncle, and she had a baby but had to give the baby up for adoption, and Lindsay found this letter in the institution where the baby was adopted into, and she paid the institution, but she wrote, so I think it's really, I suppose, testament to Lindsay's acute eye as a historian, that she wasn't saying, looking for the kind of, rape wasn't that common argument, by looking at the military archives, etc. Social history has a huge role, and perhaps the institutions are somewhere we need to look for more of the hidden evidence of this issue. Okay. It's a very poignant piece. So, again, I mentioned reports of rapes in the military archives are also evident. They're not as common as the hair cutting, etc., but there are references in the military archives. So the contention that, I suppose, women suffered less brutality really does need to be revised. Much of this abuse is by definition, as I said, hidden and covered up. I want to mention a couple of well-known cases now before I get, just check the time, how am I doing, before I get near the end. Yeah, getting there. We started at 5 past, didn't we? Yeah, so I'm trying these, as I don't want to keep talking all night. So again, I suppose, so one of the, are you familiar with this case, any of you? Okay, yeah, interesting. So this, again, this file was only released in 1980, which I find phenomenal. And again, as I say, we really are talking about something hidden. A lot of talk last week about the 75 years for the Rhine report, etc., the testimonials. Well, you know, this is a similar kind of thing. So Kate really, again, a very sad story. So again, I don't know if you can see at the top of that file, it's not on that page, the word secret. So again, this is in Q, so it's not in the Irish archives. This court of inquiry, this is a court of inquiry of 1921. To cut a long story short, Kate Moore was found murdered in Dundrum, County Tipperary on the 21st of December 1920, after spending an evening in the local pub with a group of British soldiers from the Lincolnshire regiment, including a Private Bennett. Kate, interestingly, was an unmarried mother of one, age 45 at the time of her death, and she worked as a servant for a local farmer. And so what's horrific about this story is the report into her death. She was found, and again I'll quote, she was found she wasn't quite dead, she was still alive. She was found at the back of a house. The local doctor was called, a neighbour. But the report says as follows into her death. Secret finding, the court declares, and remember this is a military court, closed this file until 1980. And it got into the papers, the story, because she was killed, obviously. If a woman is killed, the transgressive stories tend to come to the fore, you know, rather than, as I said, if it's just a sexual assault, we probably we'll never know some of these cases. But this woman was killed. And the reason why it came to the fore was she was found with extensive vaginal wounds were recorded in the investigation files. But nobody was ever found guilty for her manslaughter, as it was called at the time. And again, this is what I suppose by the more lenient attitude to sexual crime. So anyway, secret finding. The court declares that the cause of death of the said deceased was fracture at the base of the skull, which she was hit on the head, obviously, but it was accelerated by hemorrhage from and around of the vagina. That such wounds were caused by some person or persons unknown, and that such person or persons unknown are guilty of manslaughter. So whoever did it is not considered guilty of murder. I concur, this is the report. There is no direct underlying evidence to connect Private Bennett, who was found drunk near her, or any other soldier with this woman's death, except that he was found near her and other officers had been seen in her company. So this was the investigation. The file also records how the local doctor, Dr. McCormick, who attended to Kate, concluded both wounds were probably caused by some blunt instrument. So, another, I forgot to bring the transcript to read this out, but this one again, Nora Healy, cutting a very long story short, Cork woman, she was pregnant near the end of her confinement with her husband, who'd been a former soldier, First World War. Two soldiers came in, and one of them took her out the back and raped her. And she and her husband went the next day. They gave a testimony to the local barracks. She actually saw her, one of the perpetrators, and said it to this Sergeant Normoyle, what's his name? So the letters are all there, you can read them all. And he said to her, never mind, don't say anything now. So it's again this kind of, I suppose, notion of not saying anything. Okay. It's another one, and again I have to acknowledge a few people. Andy Bielenberg gave me this one. The Ernest Blythe one earlier was from John Borganova, and Padraig O'Rourke has also been really helpful, and John Journey as well. A whole team of people, if they find something in this topic, they let me know immediately, so I have to thank them all. Marie Coleman as well. So this is again, it's from the Manchester Regiment, and they're just recording everything on a daily basis there in Ballincollig. And again, you'll see this less detailed kind of, I suppose, mention of something in the middle of a file, rather than those very detailed, what I call transgressive violence cases that I mentioned a minute ago. So yeah, another rape here. It interconnects hair cutting and rape. In the diary of the activities of the Manchester Regiment based in Cork. This entry is for the 29th of November 1920, and it says a young woman was held up, you can't really read it there, it's in the middle, a young woman was held up by two uniformed men near Ballincollig at 9 p.m. and raped. As she had been threatened with bobbing, hair cut short in brackets, this is thought to be the work of the rebels. Now again, it's in the diary. There's no way of kind of connecting a mention like that. We don't know who it was, etc. But it's in the diary, it crops up. So there's lots of kind of, I suppose, mentions like that, but there's less evidence. Okay, example. So it's an example, I suppose, of how hair cutting as a warning of something worse to come was mentioned. This also occurs in the case of Bridget Noble. Are you familiar with this one? Castletownbere, sorry, some of them are Cork. These issues are not confined to Cork, I should say. So Bridget Noble, it's an interesting one. Again, this is in the Cork Fatality Register. You can look it up online, the story of Bridget. And she was shorn, her hair was shorn before she was ultimately killed by the IRA in March 1921. Now we know the number of women who were killed is far, far less than the number of men. But some women were killed. Okay, there's lots of other recently released online files from the military service pension collection which document the danger women experienced. Catherine Collins' application from 1939 documents her activities in County Clare from 1917 to 1923, and the file refers to, in inverted commas, the outrage she suffered, as well as other rays and incidents. Now the word outrage comes up a lot. It is suggested that it's a reference to a physical assault or a rape. It certainly is used in other cases where we can see there was a rape, but that doesn't mean that we can prove it happened in all these cases, so I suppose we do have to be careful. But it crops up as a word. Now the final one I want to mention really is one that's really, I suppose, and this is where I suppose the emotional cost of getting involved in these stories really is. This is very difficult material to listen to. It's very difficult material to research, as is all violence. And I want to mention finally, and I'm conscious I'm talking about the more transgressive examples where we have better evidence. So this is one of the stories that has come through in the most recent batch from the military archives from last May, where I think there were an extra 400 files, wasn't it, were added. And this is, so again, just to kind of, and I'll finish on this one in a moment. So Margaret Doherty was from Foxford, County Mayo, and she was a victim of gang rape in 1923. There's another very well-known gang rape case, that of a Mrs. Biggs, Alleyne Biggs in County Tipperary. Again, very well documented in terms of a compensation claim. Gemma Clark has written about this in her book. This one, though, is a more recent one, so that has come through in the files, in the military files. And it's an application from her mother, Catherine. I've looked up, family, I've seen the grave of Margaret, etc. She was the youngest of 9, the youngest only daughter, all brothers. 3 of her brothers died in two in the First World War, another one for the British Army as well, but the others were all Republicans. So again, it shows you the kind of, I suppose, complexity. None of this is simple, particularly when you look at familial questions, and if you put gender in the mix, well then, as you can see, it makes it even more complex. We get a very muddy interpretation of Irish Revolutionary history. So Margaret, the documents in her case, which are online, the file relates to her mother Catherine's receipt of a partial dependence gratuity of £112 and 10 shillings sterling under the Army Pensions Acts in respect of her daughter, Cumann Intelligence Officer Margaret Doherty. Margaret's death on the 28th of December 1928, which again is quite soon after, in the mental hospital in Castlebar, was deemed attributable to her service with Cumann. It is stated with accompanying medical evidence that on a night in May-June 1923, Margaret Doherty was taken from her family home, dragged outside by 3 masked National Army members, and stripped naked away from the house. Her hands were tied, she was held at gunpoint and outraged, raped, the word is used in the file, by them in succession. In this file, the word rape is explicitly used. Maggie, as she was called, never recovered psychologically or physically. And we see the psychological trauma. There is loads of evidence of nervous breakdowns, psychological trauma, all of those kinds of things as well. Partly through witnessing other kinds of violence, seeing violence, but also experiencing violence in this way. Prior to this, she was in exceptional health and had served extensively, including during the War of Independence, the Civil War. According to a letter signed by Maggie's brother, dated 16th of September 1935, a sworn inquiry by officers of the Free State was held into the attack. Neither the exact date, the perpetrator's name, or the file documenting the result of this inquiry have been released. Now, in fairness to the archives, I have been onto them and we are looking into it, but the legal aspects have to be looked at. Another such attack, just to finish, in June 1922, involved the horrific gang rape of a Protestant woman in Dromineer, County Tipperary, by 4 young local anti-treaty IRA men, and it is known who they are in this case, so it is different in the sense that they have been named. Mrs. Alleyne M. Warburton Biggs, Mrs. Biggs as she's called. Alleyne, it's a horrific story. Systematic rape a number of times. I think she was raped 8-9 times. It's transgressive violence, I suppose, at its extreme. She was very badly injured as well, psychologically and physically, and I think, on Margaret's case, the physical injuries were as bad as the psychological, a moment ago, Maggie Doherty. So she fled to England afterwards, and she was actually, the reason why her file survives is she was awarded a large sum of compensation, documented in an Irish Grants Commission file that, as I said, remained closed until 1980, as far as I can see. Her husband had a nervous breakdown after the incident. He was present when the attack happened, in which she was reported to have been outraged on 8 or 9 different occasions. So, okay. So there's a lot more I could say and analyse about this, but I'm out of time. But I just want to, if that's okay, Georgina, draw together a few conclusions, I suppose. So again, there are more numerous references to very frightening raids where women are injured, roughly treatment, often in their night clothes. You see this again, the raids are often at night, or undressed, etc., where it's not explicitly stated that a sexual assault occurred, but sometimes there are intimations, I suppose, of this. Again, the final example was, and other people have written about this, Joyce, Dorney, etc., the Kenmare incident. And again, I just want to use the quote. I'll come back to that in a minute. Sorry, I just wanted to say, this is kind of controversial, but Martin Hogan was the leader in the Biggs attack, and there are 2 commemorations, two plaques. He was actually ultimately killed on Grace Park Road. This reminded me. And then the other one is in Nina. So again, these are very difficult questions in terms of commemoration and how, we haven't had a truth commission, a reconciliation process, and I'm just going to move along. I want to finish with this statement. So the Kenmare incident, again, Paddy O'Daly is the name mentioned here, once or twice removed from Michael Collins, right? Again, I'm not an expert on these things. He was involved in the Ballyseedy massacre, are you familiar with that? Yeah. So this attack occurred after Ballyseedy, and obviously, again, I think, is it John Dorney has said, same kind of default position to kind of cover up by, I suppose the so-called cabinet of the time, the ministers, etc. And this one was, again, the tendency to view, so 2 young girls, how do I tell this story in 2 seconds? So they're the daughters of Dr. Randall McCarthy in Kenmare, and it's often the situation that they were fraternising with soldiers and they were dragged out, but it was kind of horrific because they had motor oil poured in them, and that causes a lot of problems, but it also causes your hair to fall out, apparently, from greasy oil, old oil, etc. And just quite a bit that you could say on this. Their faces were covered, they were badly beaten, whipped, etc., but also allegedly raped. And it was actually a kind of almost a revenge, because the story is the officer who reported O'Daly for Ballyseedy had been friendly with these girls. O'Daly asked them out to the local dance and they said, no, you're just a murderer. So it was a kind of a revenge. Do you know what I'm saying? So actually if you drill down, you know, it's actually about the kind of social relations among men and women in as much as it is about, so you kind of have, I suppose, a situation of chaos and transgressive violence. And this, I suppose what I'm saying is women were not unimpacted by this. Anyway, Ernest Blythe at the time in his witness statement referred to the young women as tarts. Apparently the girls were dragged out of their beds, apparently they were, and beaten with belts. No great harm was done to them, and the outrage was more an indignity to them than anything else. I did not agree personally with O'Higgins, who was actually quite disturbed by this, if you look at the records, in feeling particularly revolted at what seemed to me to be merely a case of a troupe of tarts getting a few lashes that did them no harm. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I had just one more slide actually. I'll just go to the end. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I think we probably all could have listened for a bit longer, albeit a very difficult subject. I think that goes without saying.
Yeah.
But I'm sure people have questions. Would anyone like to start?
I just have a question. There was one slide which referred to pregnancy after a rape. Is there any evidence or much evidence that there were many pregnancies?
No,
No.
not that I have come
Yeah.
across. Very difficult.
Yeah.
That would be, there must have been.
Yeah.
Possibly, again, interesting, Lindsay's work, looking at institutions. So maybe that's where
Maybe
the answer lies.
there.
Yeah, that's where the answer lies. There is another one. Hang on, can I go back to this? Actually, I've just thought of one. There's another one in Limerick, but it's a black and tan baby, and the mother, the names are redacted. So the story is the mother and the daughter who had the baby. They moved into Limerick City and changed their names. She had the baby. Yeah, because she was at risk from the Republicans. And they did try to get her. She went to work in a house. Sorry, I'll try and find it now as I'm talking. And the woman she worked for tipped her off, and she escaped out the back window. Women escaping through windows is a theme that occurs quite a lot in Irish history. Very interesting.
Did she keep the baby or was it adopted?
I think this one adopted, yeah. She was in the Union, as it was called in Limerick. I'll try and find it out. Yeah, so yes and no, I suppose, but it's very hard to, I mean, we need lots of PhDs and studies, you know, this is, and we need sources, obviously. These new sources have transformed how we think about these issues, you know. We have to think about them a lot more, but they really have. So I have to go through them all. Margaret. That's the report on the big, so we can quickly pass that one again. Don't want to be trolled. So that's just a very bad attack in West Cork that I had in Bandon. No, that's not it, is this it? Yeah, that's it, I'll let you read it, yeah. But the names are redacted. But I don't know if you know, with these files, whoever gave the statements, they were actually given an original copy, and they often have the version where the names are not redacted.
Okay. And Katrina Crowe talks about that in relation to the oral testimony for the Ryan Commission as well recently. I think, and that's one of the things that's come out of what you're talking about is kind of weaving Clodagh and the institutional
Yeah.
investigations, and it's kind of just, it's women and gender relations in 20th century Ireland, really. This is just one aspect of a big story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's live, you know, in terms of archives and stuff.
Well, it's how we should approach sources critically. Really, this is, you know, so yes, we need to bring out these stories, but we also, they're framed, they're incomplete sometimes. You know, they're not all released. You know, the inquiry into Maggie Doherty, that hasn't been released alongside the other stuff.
Yeah.
So this is where the state is involved.
Yeah.
We have to approach the sources critically, at the same time use them as a resource.
Yeah, and there's also a hierarchy of sources, so where
Sure.
oral testimony is seen almost, you know, at times as being a lesser version of a source, whereas something that's statistical and approved by the state is published or, you know, recorded at the behest of the state is almost given a credence and authority greater than somebody's actual telling of their own story as it was experienced to them. There's a lot around that. I think, you know. There must be other questions, I imagine.
It's come to silence.
Is it too simplistic to say that it was the way that women were treated in history and at the time anyhow? You know, I mean, if you think of what we learned about 1916, Elizabeth O'Farrell, that was treated, but in a greater term, is that too simplistic?
Well, I think Ireland was and is a patriarchal society, so that has to be a part. I mean, so why does sexual violence occur? Because there's gender inequality, I suppose, is again the simplistic answer. But obviously in a period of conflict then, I suppose, the way in which women's bodies in particular become, I suppose, sites of violence in all wars, etc., and how this might apply in an Irish cultural context is, I suppose, the tricky bit, isn't it, in terms of, well, okay, there was hair shearing in Ireland, but how is that different to what happened in Spain or Algeria or Greece, where, you know, we know, you know, or contemporary Sudan, or so the simple thing is these are patriarchal practices that predominantly occur in relation to women, not exclusively, it has to be said, you know, but I suppose predominantly in relation to women. So yes, they do reflect what was, again, to use the term from last week, coercive control. So yes, but then I suppose the complex aspect of it, I suppose, is then what I just said, kind of linking these kind of culturally specific, even almost community-based norms, in some cases, how women are singled out in a community and all of that. And I think Ryan's daughter does that exceptionally well, doesn't it? The community. It's a weird community, really. But there's lots of stereotypes. It's not a brilliant film, really, in many ways. It's, you know, there's a lot of stereotypes in it. You know, but it does, the power of community, small communities, but rural, urban, all of that. But these practices are rural and urban, you know, so they're not confined.
Is there any history of how women who were leaders reacted?
Yes, there is. So Margaret Ward and Louise Rhine would have analysed the Irish Citizen, for instance. So the women's movement were obviously, so you remember, Claire, which of these suffragettes used to sit in the courts? I've forgotten her name. I'm having a brain freeze, as my kids say. So yeah, Duggan, Louise, Peg Duggan, I think. She habitually sat in the courts, the courts, and often what she was reporting on were what we might call regular cases of sexual assault and incest, in particular with children. But there was a lot of reported assault of domestic servants in particular, and that's where you can see, right, the power hierarchy between servant and master. Again, probably there might be pregnancies that crop up, but you know, so I suppose we're only now looking at how revolution, the Irish Revolution, because it's so prevalent, it's everywhere, isn't it, in public discussion, how that connects to these issues specifically, whereas, as I said, these were questions for all of society at the time, but it was coming out of that moral concern, you know, and again, I suppose, that somehow women in particular might have been culpable in their attack. They were, you know.
But it's, again, it's a theme that's in the troubles. You know,
It is.
on both sides. It's there.
It is.
There's a way that men asserted themselves.
Absolutely, and again, we haven't
Yeah, we don't talk about it. We do.
scratched the surface there really. So I suppose it's how. So the women's movement would have been quite concerned. I mentioned Hannah Sheehy Skeffington's document as well. Yeah.
You were just talking about that lady who was in the courts reporting, and I was wondering at the time, were names actually reported as well? Because now you don't name the victim or,
They were, I think, yeah. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure. So if you check Louise Rhine's book on the Irish Citizen, she refers to it. They were written up in the Irish Citizen newspaper, most of which is online. I think it's in Trinity actually, most of the Irish Citizen. But of course, very few prosecutions,
Yes.
virtually none. Virtually none. And you can kind of see the cultural context, the Blythe quote, the Carrigan report, you're kind of getting the picture of this sort of predominant social attitudes at the time.
The Carrigan report, was he too dismissive? Was Carrigan too dismissive, or was it that he was too honest?
He was too honest, and he reported a significant rise. Yeah, so it was literally quashed.
What was the prompt behind the Cargill report? What prompted the commencement of
Well, I suppose it was concern. There was, I suppose, these cases were coming up, so there was a concern, I suppose, as to why this was occurring. I think there was, so it possibly was the previous government who introduced it, but it was then sort of De Valera's government, I think, which quashed it. So there might have been a difference. Again, I haven't really, I've read the Finola Kennedy piece, I find it very interesting, but I think there was a different attitude in the new government. And that kind of fits, doesn't it, with what we know now around institutions, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, so that kind of cultural attitude. 2019. Do you know what I'm saying? So again, there hasn't been an awful lot of work done on this. I think it's mentioned in some of the bigger histories of Ireland, the Carrigan report. But that there's actually a social policy, almost I think criminologist in the UK, who's Anthony Tierney, who's written about these issues in Ireland. And there's some obviously stuff on sexuality. Lindsay Arnold Byrne would actually have looked at this as well. But there does need to be a lot more work done, and I suppose that if you think about it, when the revolution was, and then we should be looking 10 years later, tracking those continuity of attitudes. We have a tendency to, particularly at the moment of commemoration, we're all doing it, looking at the revolution. But of course, these issues were there before and after it. So as I said, what drew me into this was this idea that this really wasn't a problem in Ireland. Sure, that didn't happen in Ireland. In the Irish Revolution, it was different. But in fact, what we do need is to extend, isn't it, that analysis and look at that. I didn't have time at the end. One of the things I became quite interested in as well. I mentioned Maggie Doherty, who ended up in Castlebar. I've come across a couple of other cases of Bridget O'Shea in her statement. Kerry had witnessed. And again, these were women very involved in, so she would have been going out at night, bringing food, messages, some of the men were hiding out. I think there was an outrage mentioned as well. That could have been an attack, we don't know. But she had a massive nervous breakdown and was institutionalised. And her brother writes very movingly in the application, about how she was never the same again, a kind of an innocent. And again, someone who was, I think Anne Dolan has spoken about this, the trauma, and then there was another woman who, Niall Murray, was written about in the Examiner. Can I have to keep going with the slides? I'm now giving the rest of the talk and the questions. Oh, now I've lost it, sorry. But she, County Clare, ended up after the revolution, again, very typically involved in all kinds of revolutionary activity. And we do have to study this, women's agency, Cumann na mBan, all of that. But I think we also need to maybe, again, we don't want to reproduce the heroic narrative too much either. We also need to look at the impact, of what was a very serious period of conflict, So she was, I have it now, sorry, she was based in County Clare, and like that she had a breakdown, and she ended up in the care of the Sisters of Charity, and the nuns applied for the pension on her behalf.
You're joking.
And so that's how many is that? That's 3 that ended up in institutions. So I think there is a link between institutionalization and the trauma of the revolution, and its medical history, social history. I don't have time to go off and look in Castlebar and all these places. I'd love to, if I didn't have a day job. But there's vast potential to broaden the narrative beyond how many were killed in
Absolutely.
Kilmichael,
Yeah.
which is really important. I'm not knocking it. I live with a historian, but this is also really important too. Let's see if I can find it now. But you can even see, looking at the sources, there's a lot to put together here. Yeah. This is another one, the West Cork, and as I said, where she was followed upstairs in her nightdress. I was getting to that point at the end, and nothing happened in the statement, but it was quite. They were pushed about, they were injured. The mother was pushed to the ground, all this kind of thing.
I've read in the past where showing knowledge of anything sexual or having any kind of sexual knowledge for an unmarried woman in Ireland in court cases was almost evidence that you were guilty.
Yeah.
So in a way, to report that you've been raped suggested you knew what was happening to you, which meant you had knowledge of sex. So by admitting you were raped, you were almost automatically admitting you were immoral in the terminology of the time. So they caught you every way.
That you had agency.
Yeah. That you're
Totally.
Yeah, that there was no way of saying you were raped without admitting guilt almost in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very, there's internationally a lot of analysis has been done. Here she is, Miss Begley, here she is. Delia, I couldn't think of her name. Delia Begley for Dennis suffered a nervous breakdown after 10 men were wounded while making explosives and institutionalized. So in the application, Miss Begley had no estate. In fact, she was destitute. She fought bravely for her country, but when she became helpless, no one wanted her, not even her relations. I find that really sad, that she did all this, and then, So, I don't know, what are we dealing with? Trauma, memory, intergenerational, silence. It's grim, as I said, really. It's not a happy story, but an important one, I think.
Yes.
Okay, at the back, yeah.
Hi. Can I ask a kind of a related question? So in looking at sources in the military, Bureau of Military History, I have come across, in relation to County Monaghan and Cumann na mBan, I've come across a girl who was very active in Cumann na mBan and then ended up marrying an auxiliary. Shock horror. Which caused quite a stir at the time.
Okay.
And
was she pregnant?
so, no, no, doing the sums on that actually not. But like I suppose she was captain of Castleblaney Cumann na mBan. She was treasurer of North Monaghan, very active, and then the auxiliaries came to raid her mother's pub one day, and this soldier fell in love with her, and this is actually documented in a document in the National Library. So I don't know, there certainly was a lot of ill feeling from other members of Cumann na mBan, feeling that this lady, also Margaret, had let down their
Yes.
side
Yeah.
by,
Yeah.
by, I suppose, turning so much full circle and marrying
Yeah.
a British soldier. And I'm wondering, maybe that would be another
Yeah.
way of researching another part of the story
Sure.
of, like, even though they were from Monaghan, he was from Bristol and they got married in Dunleary,
Yeah. Yeah.
which was,
Yeah.
It's. I mean, that's the kind of the good part, I suppose. Maybe I don't know what happened in their lives, but I suppose I'm dealing with the abusive situations. But again, I'm guessing people fell in love, or you know that you know life also went on, and you know
but I'm nearly surprised that
it's
she,
it's a very interesting story. Yeah.
but I'm nearly surprised that she was allowed to do that she wasn't, you know, victimised like this. you know,
Yeah.
by,
But again, I suppose I can give you one anecdotal story. I mean, my grandmother in County Meath employed someone to work in the house with her, local girl, and she always used to say, "Oh, they used to be with the soldiers," and one of them had a baby with one of the soldiers during the revolution, and my grandmother was warned to let her go by X, whoever. And she said no. She refused. She refused to. So, again, that's only a micro story. But I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, life, the complexities of life and human emotions, and you know, the history of emotions has to also come in to these stories as well. And I suppose this is why the military aspect is often presented as a very concrete, them and us, and the regiment did this, and yes, the regiments did that, but there was a whole other aspect of life as well, which, you know, exactly, I mean, that's a fascinating story. You should really follow it up and check, you know, and maybe the family might speak to you. I don't know, the family still around?
I know, I tracked down the family and they had no idea.
They'd no idea. Interesting.
Did they move away from Monaghan?
They eventually did move to Bristol to his
Yeah.
family. Well, they had 2 children in Monaghan.
Yeah.
You know, they had 4
There you go.
children and 2 of them were born in Monaghan,
Yeah.
and the connection always stayed between
Yeah.
Monaghan and Bristol, but they had no idea that their grandmother had been in Cumann na mBan.
Yes.
Never heard the phrase,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, that's the airbrushing. I think a lot of this was airbrushed from the family memory as well as the official history, or never mind the state narrative. So, but it is wonderful to see all this now, to be able to ask these questions and to find those records. And, you know, it really has transformed the way we think of the very idea of revolution, never mind the Irish Revolution. Yeah.
I think it was a great start to the series, and I think everybody will be put their hands together again to thank them.